Hello, I'm Adelina, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our conversation on freedom in God and human nature. Today, we're joined by Michael Younker, historical research specialist at the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, along with two student panelists. As we open Season 5 of Life with God, titled God is Freedom, we'll explore various aspects of this concept, starting with a quick speed round to get to know our guest. What is a favorite vacation memory?
Vacation memory. Hiking in Switzerland, in the mountains in Colorado. We did a lot of traveling when I was young. So road trips. I loved road trips.
So, what is your favorite pet? And beyond that, cats or dogs?
My favorite pet would have been my first cat, and I love dogs, but I grew up with cats. So cats.
Name a character. Let's say name a character traits you admire in people.
I like good communication skills, openness. I like thoughtfulness, kindness. These are obviously the important things I think that many of us as Christians should seek in others. So they're what I admire.
What is your favorite ice cream flavor?
Ice cream. When I was a child, it was most definitely just vanilla. Once I was in a store presented with every opportunity under the sun, but I did not know what they were, and so my freedom of what I was familiar with limited me to vanilla. I asked in almost tears, "Mom, do they have vanilla?" When they had every other flavor imaginable. So, but I like caramel and other flavors as well.
Okay. If you were to live in a place or a location forever, what place would that be?
Here on earth or in the eternal city that Abraham was seeking. I enjoy my country of heritage, Switzerland. I love the contrast because it can be very warm in the summer down in the valleys, but you can always see snow year round within sight, and I like that visual contrast.
Which Bible character do you identify with?
Which Bible character? Oh my, many of them at different times in life, and I think it's important to have more than one that you identify with. Um, Very hard to choose just one. Very hard. Uh, when I was younger, I would say someone like Timothy when Paul says, "Don't let them despise your youth." When we're young and trying to enter the church world. But at different phases of life, you find many different characters inspire you.
If you were,
Job, Job, if I had to say one, because of the deep questions that he had to ask in philosophy.
if you were a water form, what would you be?
A water form?
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure what
Like
do we
type of
mean
water.
here. A type of water? You mean like ice, steam? Okay. We're gonna move into the quantum world today a little bit, so we'll say steam, something a little
Okay.
more vacuous there, moving around.
And
So,
why? Sorry, why?
yeah, well, yeah, the reason for steam is because, of course, it can become water, but it's related to heat. And I'm very interested in physics, energy, and matter and materialism, and how those subjects enter into philosophy.
Okay. So, would you erase a memory from your past or all lessons learned?
I prefer to go with the lessons learned approach to my past. Occasionally I have obviously said or done things that are regrettable or misunderstood, etc., as we all have. But I prefer to go with the lessons learned approach than erase the past.
Among all people you came to know, who played an important role in your journey of faith?
I would first point to my family, my parents. I like to elevate and support the role of good parents and family in your life. I have had several good teachers at different levels. from academy, high school age days through college and university. But I'd rather not elevate any one of them and neglect the others. So we'll stay with family. But I've been influenced by many teachers throughout life.
How did you overcome one of your fears?
One of my fears. Well, when I was young, I was afraid of jumping into the off the diving board into a swimming pool when I was a young boy, and so my father went with me, jumped a few times with me, holding my hand when I jumped, and then he tricked me and then released my hand and let me go alone. So you learn, well, I lived, didn't I? So a little bit of the cold water approach to growth, but I wasn't afraid of jumping off the diving board anymore later, so it worked.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And also for being here again. We really enjoyed our first conversation with you on power.
All
And
right.
I hope our readers, if they haven't yet, our viewers, I hope our viewers will be able to watch that conversation. It will probably be coming back today in some connections with freedom. But today we essentially start our season on freedom. So this is our first episode on the topic of freedom. Trying to define the concept from the perspective of how God manifests his freedom, since God is our example, right? And since we created in the image of God, share in that freedom. So it's a very complex discussion. We're going to take a philosophical and theological approach, kind of interdisciplinary, and see how far we get into our definitions today. Before the discussion, I would like to ask the group a question that is more personal. Can you recall an early experience of freedom?
Oh, I actually can recall an episode of lack of freedom, to be honest.
Okay.
You know, when you're a kid and you want to, go outside and play with your friends, and you're crazy to do that. And I was as well at one time. And my dad just came to me and said, "No, you're not going to play outside." And I was like, "Why? What's the reason? It's not raining. I'm not sick. I didn't do like anything bad. I was a good boy at the time." So, and he said, "No, just because, just because." So this lack of freedom, and probably he had like his reasons at the time, but I actually didn't comprehend. And that is one of the moments that kind of, struck me. Like, I don't have freedom to do whatever I want and what a time I want. So that really, stayed with me and impacted with me, changed, my conception of freedom into this day, that we're not as citizens or as persons or sons and daughters, we are not free as, or we think we're not free as we would like to.
Thank you, John. That's actually an interesting experience, which makes me wonder right now. We may get into the conversation with this, but how you experienced a lack of freedom because you encounter a restriction, right? But maybe you experienced it as a lack of something, as a shortcoming, as something negative, basically, because you didn't understand the reason for it. That maybe that same experience could have been explained to you as an opportunity for exercising freedom. But we'll get to that later. Of course, as children, that's more complicated in relation to adults. What about you, Raphael?
There was a time I went canvassing, and I remember I was the one in charge of cooking for all the people. And then I went to the market and I saw all the options I had there. Whatever I would choose to do, I would. So I was amazed because of that. I said, "Wow, I can choose whatever I want to cook." Besides, that is somehow silly, but it was my first realization, I think, of freedom. There was another situation when I rented my first apartment. I said, "Oh, now I can arrange things the way I want. I can have my own schedule the way I want as well. Nobody will say, do this, do that, or place this furniture somewhere else." And I would choose everything. Even if I wanted to have a messy room, I would, and nobody would say anything. So there was a few instances where I felt free.
So you experience freedom as opportunity to choose, and also as independence, kind of. You seem to connect the two
Somehow, yeah.
partly to independence. Yeah. Yeah, thank you for sharing. Let's go into the discussion on freedom from a philosophical, theological perspective. We'll probably start with philosophy. So let's open up with a question about the very existence of freedom, because we speak about it assuming we have it, I think, and probably the four of us in the conversation, we believe we do have it, but it's not always in our society today, maybe especially in the West, possibly also in the East, maybe we'll learn that is not always currently, at least, a presumption, an assumption. Yeah, so Michael, in your research, your reading, your writing, what have you come across in regard to the concept of freedom, whether it exists or not? What guarantees do we have that it does exist?
Yeah, freedom is a wonderfully rich, complex, and deep question. It's the kind of well that you can bring water out of forever and ever, and still find more to discuss. But we're talking about the possibility of freedom here in the first question. Do we have it? And what have we encountered here in the recent times? I just want to start by sharing that the reason I find it very interesting to ask whether or not we have freedom is because I have personally bumped into, throughout the course of life, the walk of life, several individuals that don't believe they have free will. They don't believe they have freedom. And I'm talking here not political freedom, but even personal freedom. They don't have control over their own choices, feelings, inclinations, preferences, etc. And it's fascinating to try and reason with them. Are you sure you don't have freedom? Did you choose, which side to get out of the bed? Did you choose what to eat? But, they obviously were convicted at the time that they didn't. So where are they getting these ideas? Is my question. Where do they get these assumptions? Why? What reasons do they give to explain why they don't have freedom? And I found the answers quite interesting as I've talked with them. And put very briefly to start the discussion is that this idea is not exactly rare. It actually is held by a lot of very intelligent people. These are not stupid people or uneducated people. As a matter of fact, a large number of professional psychologists and neuroscientists basically have or believe things about or write their convictions about the nature of the human mind and its physical nature, its characteristics. And because of their belief in cause and effect, determinism in nature, that they see in all the laws and physics and so on, Newtonian physics, they believe they essentially apply to the human brain as well. And so essentially, there is no such thing as freedom because nature is determined. It flows in cause and effect order. So yes, this is actually a fairly common idea out there. And I find that fascinating how much of that may undergird assumptions about the Western worldview, whether or not we have freedom. So I'll pause there.
Okay, so nature can determine. Let me start there. So the idea is that nature it does. The nature does determine our choices essentially. So therefore, they're not real choices.
Yes.
But in a sense, I concur, probably not fully, because maybe the way I look at it is that the nature that God gave us is such that there is still a personal aspect to it, I guess what I'm seeing in this answer, right? That it's not somebody else who coerces me. It's like an eternal impulse maybe that, but what is missing from this is the will part.
Yes.
Right? So
exactly.
Okay. So
yes.
we have this issue of determinism on one hand from a kind of a naturalist perspective on reality, including the human being as a mechanism, right?
A machine. Yes.
A machine, yeah. And then we have another piece of the conversation on determinism in regard to being to somebody else externally determining our actions and our choices, which was more like a theological concept.
Right. There's a little bit of a paradox at play here, or you'd say a contradiction outright, because often the people that do their studies on the human brain with the assumption or arrive at the conclusion that it's not free are often manipulating other people through their studies. You know, they do sociological studies or psychological studies of people, and they find that they can control them. And you'd be surprised what good psychology and manipulation can do. You know, you can really control people and, influence their brain. You can give them either substances like drugs that alter their brain, that controls the way that they think or process things, or you can use external varieties of emotional peer pressure from the outside to still manipulate someone to make a decision that you want them to make. And so it's fascinating that throughout this entire process, those doing the research from the outside, the so-called objective perspective, one has to ask, are they making free choices in how they do their research into whether or not we have freedom? You know, you run into a tension there of whether or not they can truly be objective in the questions they're asking and answering. But yes, there is a very complex interplay, without a doubt, in how we view nature and how we view the human. And this is why, if freedom does exist, throughout most of the past, people have separated the human being and the human mind from nature. They've made a radical separation and introduced varieties of what we call dualism, dualist philosophies that try and separate the human mind or soul from nature. And that's the way that most philosophers in recent history as well as into the past, that's how they created human freedom, because they don't see real freedom like the human kind of freedom throughout the rest of nature. Tiny mimicking parts in some of the higher animals, but if you look closely or study them closely, but obviously in inanimate, lower life forms and rocks and so forth, they see no freedom. So they try to separate the human.
So since you already brought this up, I wanted to delve a bit more into the effect that this view has. But let's try to connect the natural determinism with divine determinism and see if there's a common ground there to how either or both of these can affect somebody's view of the self and of others as well, because
Sure.
Anthropology is both about the self and mirroring others.
It has had a very large impact. In religious circles, you'll find, again, a variety of approaches to freedom. Obviously, freedom and the idea of God are closely connected, within the minds of theologians. And again, interestingly enough, you find this problem playing out because some Christians are so convicted that God's omniscience, which I know is another topic that you discuss in different places, God's knowledge is so complete and total that he knows the future. You know, this is a common theme for many Protestant Christians as well as others. There's prophecies in the Bible and they've wrestled with this. And because of the nature of this prophetic kind of knowledge that God can give, they've assumed that God has an absolute knowledge of the future. And if God has an absolute knowledge of the future, then obviously in some way we're not really free. And so some of our Calvinist friends, for example, come to the idea that God has basically decreed everything that will happen, who will be saved, who will not be saved. And he's just dissolved for his own glory. But the freedom part of it is very fuzzy and difficult to locate. And then you ask the question, well, why would God do it this way? Well, that's because maybe they would say he's the only free being. Only God can be free. But other Christians have said, now, wait a minute, if we're made in the image of God, don't we have any freedom, any at all? And this is where the Armenians complained. Joseph Arminius was a prominent Christian philosopher and theologian who said, no, there is free will, and we need to integrate that into our theology. And that kind of, illustrates one of the greatest rifts in Protestant history.
I noticed that before we even come to realize our own existence now, and before even we are able to choose by ourselves most of our personality, most of our what we are, no, was built upon choices we had no control over. For example,
Absolutely.
I did not choose to be born. I did not choose my genes. I did not choose the place where I would be born. So this is interesting questions to ask. But besides that, I did not choose the culture. I did not choose the religion. Most of the things I inherited, let's say this way, were choices made for me. So to an extent, we are the result of choices that were made for us. So it's like freedom, it's unrealistic. And the fact that we say that God is the only free being existing in the universe, I think it's so true, thinking about this, because he can even choose his own existence. That's interesting. What do you think about that?
It is. Of course, then we ask, does God's freedom or the nature of God in some other way limit what kinds of freedom he himself will express or choose? Does he have a nature? Does he have a character? And so on. But you're right. These are profound questions. But what you touched on, I completely agree. Many aspects of our lives, socially as well as physically, you didn't choose your parents. You didn't choose your country where you're born. You didn't choose the language that you would be exposed to first. That would course through your brain, affecting the way that you think about reality, the language in which you dream. So we are naturally, or obviously, I should say, predetermined. A lot of our choices are restricted. There are obviously limitations to our freedom at the social and political level and personal level, and these are very real aspects of freedom that we all have to acknowledge.
I have a follow-up. So if our past we don't have control over, at least the past we were not aware of ourselves, or we did not choose by ourselves. Does it mean that our future is all in our control? I personally think that we have limited alternatives, and I think that an environment of freedom has abundance of everything. So even alternatives.
Yes. I agree. When I was 2 years old, I was a great admirer of the construction workers that came to work on my parents' house on the roof. And I thought that was a really cool job at the time, to work on the roof and to replace the tiles and so forth. And so at the earliest chance I got, I went to the window. I'm 2 years old, and I climbed out onto the roof to join them, with my little worker belt that my parents had given me, and I quickly found myself sliding down the roof, and thankfully a hook caught me before I fell over the side. And my parents were rather aghast at my situation and decided to limit my freedom to choose to be a roof worker at that time. But we faced many situations. But the fact that I couldn't be a roof worker at that time didn't mean I couldn't later. So sometimes a possibility in the future may not be present to us. And so we have to think about the relationship between time and freedom as well, rather than always isolating freedom to the moment. I didn't choose to be a roof worker as much as I do admire walking on the roof. My parents now send me on the roof whenever it needs to be cleaned. Now I'm forced to go up there as I grow older. But we find that freedom and time also have a connection in relationship to our experience. So
I'm going to pick up on that because that's exactly where I wanted to go. Also listening to Rafael's question. And we cannot possibly have this conversation without discussing freedom and time more in depth, especially knowing the many great conversations we had before, Michael. So what can you share to our viewers in this episode and to our group about the relation between freedom and time, and where is the moment of freedom and things of that nature?
Yeah, this is a topic that I really enjoy, the relationship between freedom and time. One of, I think, and now I share kind of my conclusions and perspective assessment after the fact, having read about it. But one of the most common assumptions that people do have about freedom, whenever they think about it, the average person, they typically do want to think about it in the present. am I free right now to do what I want to do, at least what they think they want to do, if they believe in freedom, right now, in the moment. And traditionally, freedom has typically been discussed in this way. The at least individual freedom. You have social contract theory and political freedom, which might have a temporal component in relation to laws and things of that sort. But personal freedom, individual freedom, the kind that even Christians discuss, they typically thought of it as something that occurs in the moment. Okay, so our freedom can be sliced, narrowed down into just that moment. We decide right now I'm making a decision to jump off a cliff or continue to live my life in more safe ways. So we make decisions in the moment. This is classic philosophy. They separated it from nature. Nature has temporal processes. Trees grow, die, animals live, die. You see time played out in nature, the cycles and so forth. But human freedom is separate because it's to use a fancy word here in a technical way, it's timeless. It takes place in an instant, so instantaneous that there is no duration. This is how most people think of free will. It's autonomous. It is not controlled. The free will is separate. It's completely free from influences to be free. And people think that if you don't have that kind of freedom, then you don't have freedom at all. I would challenge this assumption, as we actually look at neuroscience responsibly, since I do believe in freedom, not hiding that conclusion here today. But we do know that human choices and so forth do take place over a period of time. We'd call it a window of time, a span of time, a stretch of time, relative to how we think of time. And we know that this is true when you actually study the brain's waves when it's making decisions. We can see now, you can ask someone a question, would you like to do this or that? And your brain processes it and then you make a decision. But, when your decision is made is actually a temporal process. It takes time. And that's just the individual. You actually then apply that out to other instances like I just shared. You realize that often if you want to have greater freedom, you have to commit to a certain course of action to get there. For example, let's say you want to be free, Raphael, as you mentioned, to finally rent your own apartment or buy your own things, have your own income, your own job, and do what you want to do. That means you might have to commit yourself to, let's say, the unfreedom, the servitude of an academic program, for example. That to get the job you want, to be able to do what you want to do, you're going to have to commit to studies. I think John's in the same situation. You have to submit to the assignments and the requirements that are imposed on you with a freedom at the end of that trajectory. And this is an example, magnified from our personal, freedom to our life freedom. And you can see that meaningful freedom takes time. And this is one of the most important, ideas that humans wrestle with, because we often want things in the instant. They've done studies on children. Would you rather have one candy now, or would you rather have two candies in an hour? And it depends on what kind of person you are. Are you impulsive, or can you recognize? I'd really rather have two candies, and so I'll just wait an hour and then get two candies. But some don't. Some don't choose to express their freedom in that way. They choose to go with the short-term impulse. And why that is, and why humans develop a consciousness of time, is one of the fascinating questions that psychologists look into.
So what you're suggesting here is that the moment of choice and freedom is not an instantaneous, without duration moment, right? But is connected to, it's an extended. I know you've used that word before, right? An extended now.
Yes.
And that differentiates a view of humans from a timeless perspective to a temporal perspective, right?
Yes.
That we're actually looking at humans as temporal beings, where the past, present, and future are connected in the moment, but the moment is extended. I'm rehashing what you've shared before, but this is very important because how we view ourselves also reflects on how we view God and vice versa. So we do reflect God, whichever way we start, whether we start from understanding God from us or understanding ourselves from who God is, either way, we reflect each other. And so whether it's timeless and temporality, that makes a big difference, both for anthropology and for divinity. And so, especially for the conversation of freedom and choice here in today's discussion. Any other comments there to maybe clarify further what I just contoured here?
Are you asking me
in regards to
or our friends?
temporality, yeah, for you, in regards
Yeah.
to temporality and freedom.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. I haven't talked about it extensively today, but yes, one of my own conclusions from my own research is that humans are indeed very temporal, and that's not just a social construct imposed from above. As I said, like with doing an academic degree so that you have the freedom to do things later or get a job later. But that the human nature by itself is intrinsically, by its very nature, is a stretched out thing. And this means our freedom is part of that temporal process, is part of our life. This means that there's more ways in which determinism can intersect with our freedom, because after all, the past carries with it the burden, or we would say the weight of already being. It already is, and so we can't change the past. And so that past will it's like dragging a chain ball around. Okay, you can't let go of the past. It's part of you, and it will limit your freedom. If you let's say you decided to do grand larceny and rob a bank 10 years ago or 5 years ago, you're still going to be hauling that chain behind you, and you're in the new possibilities of freedom that you could explore today. Choices have consequences, both personally and in society, through the common experience of life that we all have. So, but that is not just, as I said, some abstract thing. It's not just because of a social law that is imposed on us that I'm guilty of robbing a bank, therefore I must limit my freedom. In point of fact, the human being by its very nature is temporal. And so what you have chosen in the past in some ways informs what you will choose in the future. Our nature is temporal. And you can see how this can have lots of effects, as we might touch on in a few minutes, on the nature of sin and a lot of the themes that theologians talk about. Here in talking within a biblical or Adventist perspective, the great controversy theme is what? Freedom played out over time. God is demonstrating before lots of beings, the whole world and the angels also, how freedom works and how sin works. And you can see that it's a process that takes time. And that can be very difficult to understand at times, but as you read the Bible carefully, I think you'll see this lesson come through time and again. So.
Yeah. Now that you quoted, God, and I can see, this topic branching and temporality, for more like a ethical and even moral standpoint, because for me it seems kind of like we have the Weberian versus Rousseauian approach here, that an individual, it's born that way, or it's changed by society, it's molded by society. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think that God, what's God's role in all of that? If we are like a product of society, or even if you're born in an evil state or in a sinful state, in our perspective over here, what is God's role on that? Where He can help us, or where He is the reason that we are that way, or how we can branch in that subject.
Yeah, you're asking a very good question. And I actually want to, I will refer to a Bible passage here in this case, because there's several that are of interest here, and one of them that I find very interesting is talking about what role does God have in this. First of all, we introduced sin into the world. One can't but start with Romans chapter 8, verses 20 to 22. And it shares, for the creation was subjected to futility. It was subjected to suffering, not willingly. The nature didn't choose this, but because of him who subjected it, Adam and his posterity. But the creation itself will be set free from its slavery, and corruption, into the freedom of the glory of the children of God as well. So it will also experience a new freedom. So the animal kingdom and so forth that are also suffering because of what we have done will also be set free. So I just want to set this context that, as it continues in verse 22, we know the whole creation groans and suffers the pains, of childbirth until now. So it's waiting to be set free. We are, that there is a higher freedom, and I'll come back to this maybe more as we go on, but there's a higher freedom that God is calling us to, because you're right that we are often born into difficult circumstances. And I find it remarkable that Paul, in specific circumstances, this is not to say that we don't believe in fighting for freedom, using the term "fight" here in a broad sense. But God also, or through the Apostle Paul, advises us to focus on the real freedom, which is the freedom from sin, and we can see that in 1 Corinthians 7 verses 20 to 22. Where he actually writes, Paul says, "Let each man remain in that condition in which he was called." And he continues, "Were you called to the Lord while a slave? Do not worry about it. But if you are able to become free, rather do that. If you can become not a slave, by all means, but don't worry about it. Okay. For he who was called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman." If you're free in the Lord, even if you're a slave politically, okay. Likewise, he was called while free, and here he kind of makes a pun on, a little play on the words, but you're the Christ slave, So if you join with Christ, and you thought you were free in the world politically, you were rich, you were powerful, you had everything the world had to offer in freedom, but you could submit to Christ, and he's saying you become Christ's slave. But if you're a slave in this world where you have no freedom, you become, free only by joining in Christ. But his point is that, it's not our circumstances that make the man, but rather the man helps inform the circumstances. God is giving us something greater and bigger than political freedom. And that's something that is difficult sometimes for people to, realize. This is actually a difficult lesson to share to the slave. Because we do believe, here in the United States, of course, we had our own problems and issues with slavery and the painful consequences that it caused and continues to cause and its repercussions throughout society today. But our goal is not simply to attain, power, wealth, and health here on this earth, but it's to have a spiritual freedom that the Bible talks about. And maybe we can talk more about that, but I'm just drawing the contrast here. So, yes, God has a role in it, but it's complicated to see.
Well, I wonder if we can even go back to the question of the original sin, not the human original sin, but the source of sin, right, with Lucifer, because essentially, what happened there is that he sought autonomy, or
Yes.
presumed to have autonomy of life, right? In that sense, had a wrong impression of himself and his own powers and freedom, and a wrong impression of God, therefore. And so
Right.
freedom seems to be the misunderstanding of freedom as radical autonomy from God seems to be at the very core of sin. Yeah, and rebellion. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, you've said it, so I can just affirm you exactly. This is the great mystery and puzzle that we have as Christians, is that spiritual freedom is not the same thing as what we might call social or political freedom. And if you go back to the origin of the fall and you look at Lucifer, Satan, and what he evidently wanted, he wanted to be elevated as high as God, as you read Ezekiel and so forth. He wanted to be like God. He wanted to have autonomous freedom, to be at the top. And what you find, and this is the mystery of sin, the mystery of iniquity, and is that when you choose that course, when you choose autonomy from God or autonomous freedom, and think that you want nothing to control you, nothing at all, you just want to be completely, totally free, you will find, according to the Bible, that you become a slave of self. A slave of greed, a slave of selfishness, and selfishness. That kind of freedom that you gain when you are self-focused is that it actually obliterates ethics. As I shared a little bit before, there's kind of a saying in America, at least ideally, not always practiced. But my freedom ends where your nose begins. You see, I can't touch you. You are supposed to have protection, autonomy from me. Okay, not autonomy in the perfect sense, but autonomy from me. I shouldn't be able to control you. But you can see that autonomous freedom of the sort that Lucifer wanted, the absolute freedom, ultimately becomes a freedom of self and self-serving, and that ultimately requires him to subject everything that that comes in front of him. All the other beings must submit to him, to his will, and become perverted. So everyone that joins in his spirit of selfishness becomes perverted to not respecting ethics, not respecting the nose of the other being, not even recognizing that other beings exist in a proper full sense. And so the why that kind of freedom, or why those kinds of beings always become selfish, is really a very philosophical question. Can you really say I'm going to sever God from my life and I'm going to be good? Well, good by what definition? And if you're really good, then you'll be like God anyway, which means you'll be selfless and care for others and so on and so forth. Ultimately, you can't bulldoze other people in your life if you're, going to actually have a harmonious kind of cooperative freedom. So, this is the great question, I think, that all of us have to wrestle with. So,
Professor, just to jump on that real quick here, it seems for me then that we have a wrong conception of freedom. We don't know what actually freedom is, or actually we misconcept it, if we can say that way. Because we need a proper definition of freedom. So what is at least in our case here, like a proper definition for freedom for us that believe in God, that already know that God plays a role in our lives, in our ethics or moral even. So what is this definition of freedom that we can take out of the Bible or out of philosophy in general?
Well, it does. The Bible does speak about freedom, often in how shall I say it, indirect ways. So it's kind of like it explains it through a process. So it takes time to understand it, which is why time is so important when we talk about freedom. But you can read just affirming that the Bible does talk about it. 2 Corinthians 3:17 is a classic verse where it says, the Lord is spirit, and where the spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. So the Holy Spirit and freedom are very closely connected. You also will read that, for example, in James 1:25, but one who looks intently at the perfect law, the law of liberty, this is the law of God, and abides by it, not having become a forgetful hearer, but an effectual doer, this man will be blessed and free in what he does. Okay, so the Bible is going to connect it with the law. And you'll find this, it's not just in the New Testament, but in the Old Testament as well. And one of my favorite verses, actually, to read that really brings this forth is Psalms 119. It's found in the Psalms chapter 119, and it says in verse 18. This is one of the more remarkable passages of the Bible, actually, and it has a lot of implications for us today. But it's the psalmist says, "Open my eyes, that I may behold wonderful things from your law." And the word there for wonderful in the original language is the root is pala in the Hebrew. And the funny thing about that word, or the interesting thing I should say about the word pala, is that it is only used in miracle contexts. For example, when God parts the Red Sea, when God works various miracles, the form of, some form of the word pala is used. And so it's very unusual to see it here in relationship to the law. The psalmist is saying, let me, open my eyes that I may see the miracle of the law of God. And that the miracle is that it frees us, it liberates us. And, Ellen White from the Adventist tradition, if I may cite her, she commonly refers to this as the miracle of miracles, the converted heart. It's a miracle. It defies what we would call those naturalistic, deterministic laws and so on and so forth. So she's very clear about this, in that it escapes our understanding. Only the Holy Spirit can do this. And this is freedom. So you are only really free, biblically speaking, when you are in harmony with the law of God. And then we ask, say that this is the law of liberty, as the Bible says, as James says, and other passages say the same thing. This has huge implications for understanding freedom at every level in society today. When you look at it personally, in the family, socially, politically, you look at what people are trying to attain when they go to war. What kind of freedom are they trying to really get? And if it isn't the freedom of love and selflessness, then is it really freedom? Or would we say right now, as we look at some of the nations that are provoking others, with war, are they really slaves to themselves? Are they slaves to ego? Are they slaves to their own imaginations? And I think the deeper you look into it, you'll find that they're slaves to themselves. So, but yeah, the Bible has a lot to say. I could share many more verses. In fact, should I go into it right now, Adelina? A few more, or come back into that? But I find it very interesting when you go to prophecy. As Christians that have a special interest in prophecy within the Adventist tradition, you go to, for example, Revelation chapter 6, verses 15 and 16. And it says, this is referring again to the time of the end, and the kings of the earth and the great men and the commanders of the rich and the strong and every slave and free man hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. And they said to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the presence of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. Okay, this is, in the judgment context. But what did it say? It says, all the great men, the rich, the strong, and every slave and every free man. So the point is that this is here political freedom. Those who think that they are free in the world, those who are slaves in the world, if you are sinful, it doesn't matter. This political freedom doesn't matter. And this is repeated again in Revelation 13 as well. Where it says, I saw another beast come up out of the earth, and he had two horns and a lamb, and spoke as a dragon. We know the nation, which is often interpreted to apply here, our country where I live. And he says, and he causes all, the small and the great, the rich and the poor, the free man and the slaves, to be given a mark on the right hand or on their forehead. And he provides that no one can buy or sell except that they have the mark. And so, but my point is, there's obviously a tension here. What does it mean by free here? Here he means those who are politically free. This is not spiritual freedom. This is political freedom. Those who are free, those who are slaves, they're all going to be subjected to this system. And you're going to have to try and find a true source of freedom somewhere else than the political sphere. So everyone will suffer from the effects of sin, is our point here. We'll take a breath there.
So let's see if I got your point.
Yeah.
As I see, evil is what makes freedom a problem. No?
Yes.
Some say even that rules limit freedom, as you mentioned about laws. But I personally think that laws and rules are not real enemies of freedom. If we let people be unlimitedly free, the world will become a nightmare. And it is a fact that evil even affects our perception of reality, and as a consequence of that, it also affects the choices we make. So without evil, the use of freedom would build a perfect and positive world. That's what I see. Am I right? What do you see then?
Without evil, well, it's difficult for us in a sinful context, because we all are already living within a sinful context, to truly imagine what a sinless world would be. But if you are reading the Bible, yes, a sinless world is possible. But to your point, this is exactly God's point of the law. Now the law are the core rules, we would say, that govern and dictate all other applications of the law that we might read throughout, for example, Leviticus and so on, in the Jewish system, in the Jewish theocracy. But if one of the rules of society is you can't murder people, I think that's self-serving. It's good for me too. It's not just good for you; it's good for me, because if that's not a law, then you'd be free to kill me, and that would kind of limit my freedom, wouldn't it? Okay, so what I'm trying to say is that the laws, the core laws, the Ten Commandments in particular, but you can point to the ones that apply to human relationships first. You can say that without these laws, we would have anarchy. We would have no freedom at all. You're right. So the rules provide us with cooperative social freedom, and if you take away those rules, anyone can stab us in the back anytime, and goodbye to your freedom. So yeah, God's laws make sense. They're not things that are designed to burden us. They're designed to liberate us, and I'm just referring simply to the Ten Commandments. They're designed to liberate us.
Yeah, I think this is where I would bring in the concept of interdependence, freedom as interdependence, and this will recur in our season, in future episodes, because this is radically different from the autonomous view, from the view of freedom as autonomy, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it was quite fascinating as you were sharing, reading the story of sin here, that Lucifer never experienced freedom as autonomy, as radical autonomy, because even God is not radically autonomous. Yes, of
Mm-hmm.
course, he is self-sustaining. You could say in that sense maybe he's autonomous, but when he creates other beings,
Mm-hmm.
that he wants to have love relationships with, then he endows those beings with freedom to reciprocate the love and to choose the love, right? So
Right.
so Lucifer never experienced that which occurred in himself as a better way or a different way of being than how God actually created him. And therefore, God's manifestation of freedom is actually interdependence, where he limits his own freedom, if we can, be so daring to say that, so that we have
Mm-hmm.
a piece of that. And in our interdependent relationship, therefore, is where, I guess, love arises. And maybe that's the whole point of existence. I don't know, right?
You've named it, and this is why it's very difficult to talk about freedom or many theological concepts that we might talk about, or philosophical concepts, because by themselves, they're isolated, because they all interconnect, the concepts themselves as well as freedom. And you're right. We could say, for example, that if you take away freedom, can you have love? Can it exist without freedom, or is that just obedience? Now, it's not that God doesn't also want obedience. And sometimes that obedience may come without a full understanding of the circumstances. You didn't understand, John, why your parents arbitrarily imposed this rule on you. Maybe they had a good reason. I don't know at the time, what the rationale was. But or it was simply training you to be obedient, which is, they were leading you to a higher good at that time. They saw the rebellious spirit in you as a young boy, and they're trying to temper that spirit. So we don't know, but the point is that God doesn't just want obedience from us; He wants loving, willing obedience, and you see this reflected throughout the Bible. We think this is just some sort of new idea or something by Christians or Jesus or something. Not at all. In the Old Testament, free will offerings were a very important part of it. In fact, the very idea, although God commanded tithe under the Levitical system, he wanted the temple built by free will offerings only. And so his presence was supposed to be a free willed, invitation by the people. If you want me to live with you, then, build me a temple. But if you don't, I won't come. You follow what I'm saying, so God wants freedom to be part of it. And when he presents before them the opportunities that face the nation, for example, in Deuteronomy, he calls heaven and earth as a witness, against you today, that I've set before you life and death, blessing and curse, so choose life that you may live. And if you do, all kinds of unlimited blessings will come upon you. So freedom is very much a part of God's relationship with us in every context.
It seems for me kind of like the biblical freedom, it's not actually just doing what you want to do, but doing what is not inherently on you in a way. Because if you think about Lucifer, for example, as like the first one to commit a sin, the sinful or the sinful way or the sin in itself was not inherently in him or on him. But he did it anyway, and God allowed that. And for us, it's kind of the same, because we are not inherently good, but God actually, gives us a chance to do good, or to actually to be good through the Spirit. So it seems like the conception of freedom in the Bible aspect, or if I say so, if I may say so, in a religious aspect, is actually to be free to choose, but to actually as well to harvest your consequences. So it seems for me like this balance, this balance that we have there. And you quoted Ellen G. White over there, and it seems for me that the Great Controversy, that is one of the most famous books of her, and actually one of the most beautiful quotes that we have, at the end of the book, it's that sin doesn't exist anymore. And in a way, God is actually sparing us from the consequences and showing actually what Adelina and you complimented, and showing love and saying,
Yes.
now we know what is the consequence of sin. Now we know what sin is, like the final consequence of sin, and then now we can actually be rid of it. So it's
Right.
kind of this show of love through freedom.
Exactly. I just want to add, I agree completely with what you said. Psalms 103:10 tells us again already from the Old Testament, He has not dealt with us. God has not dealt with us according to our sins, nor rewarded us according to our iniquities. He gives us a chance. He gives us more freedom than we deserve, given our current state. In other words, He's blessing us with an opportunity, despite our enslavement to sin. He wants to liberate us. And there's a spiritual and physical, ultimately, component to that. And the wages of sin are death, but God, gives us a chance. That's the point. Excellent.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
So I think we've covered quite a few key connections here between different concepts, but also you provided some depth on the very concept of freedom. We're very thankful for that. And we're coming to the end of the conversation, but I do want to bring one more question into the foreground, going back to the beginning of the discussion about determinism and the use of freedom, right? So we touched a bit on determinism from a naturalistic perspective, and also determinism from a divine perspective, especially in Calvinism, maybe as expressed.
Yeah.
And the common ground between the two, I think, is, you've mentioned it, but we haven't delved too much into it, the idea of lack of control, that somehow what I do is not in my control, whether it's a naturalist impulse, or whether it's a mechanistic impulse, or whether it's divinely decreed, right? But with lack of control and lack of freedom, then comes lack of responsibility. And that's, I think, is a big issue with not understanding the power that we have in being creatures of freedom, right? So maybe let's conclude the conversation with some comments about that, and then we'll go into the takeaways, to finish.
Sure. Yeah, there are many implications, as you've just suggested, that are not actually ever going to realistically be applied throughout society in any real way, to the idea that humans are not free. Because if humans really did not have any freedom and everything that you did was simply programmed, then why would we be responsible for the crimes we commit? I couldn't help it. I've heard of some notorious cases, at least in the United States. One of them was infamously called the Twinkie defense, because he took Twinkie, a sweet, a candy, and they got a rush of sugar and it made him violent, and he did something. I mean, really, just because you took some candy, drank a soda pop, it made you violent, and should get off the hook. Should be forgiven because of this. You can see the absurdities that this will lead to. So society will never realistically implement a guiltless system. So despite the fact that neuroscientists often say it, but I'm not going to, in this conversation here, it's not the time to go into the complex scientific aspects of it. To put it simply, I'll just say that it's the issues are complex and divided, and there are different opinions. And science can be interpreted differently. Nature can be interpreted differently. And I think that there is a legitimate case. People like Robert Doyle is a secular philosopher that has made a persuasive case that you can find a coherent understanding of freedom, in physics, quantum physics, randomness, and human adequate determinism, as he calls it. So it doesn't answer all the Christian questions, but I'm just saying there are alternative understandings that exist. And I think that they can be helpful, if not complete. But when you talk about freedom, we do need to keep in mind, that outside of the sin concept, there are other realistic limitations to us. I hesitate to jump into some of the super hot topics of the day, but I'll preface it by saying, we have negative freedom. We have positive freedom. Negative freedom would mean when you're free from oppression. When someone is stopping you from doing something you want to do, that's a negative oppression. And so when you attain that freedom, I'm now released from my parents. I'm released from the school program requirements. I'm now experiencing what we would call negative freedom, what some philosophers call negative freedom. I'm now free from that oppression that was blocking me from doing what I want to do. But there's another whole kind of freedom that is equally important, and it has limitations as well. And that's what sometimes they call positive freedom, and that's the freedom to do particularly what you want to do. No matter how hard you try, John, wings are not just going to sprout out of your back and let you fly like a bird. It just isn't going to happen. You're not free to do that because of your nature. You're limited by other things, not just, as we'd say, as Raphael was saying, I'm have genetics, environment, all these other deterministic factors, but one of the most important is simply the fact that I'm human. That means I'm limited in what I can do, and I cannot do all the things that I can imagine other beings being able to do. I'm not free to burrow into the ground like a worm. I'm not free to fly like a bird. I'm not free to swim in the ocean for hours at a time without breathing like some underwater creatures. I can't. I don't have gills. I can't bring in the oxygen through the water like the fish do. I just can't do it. So I'm not free to do those kinds of things. And we can speculate endlessly on the kinds of positive freedoms that were denied. As I said, one of the controversial ones I could jump into is whether or not it is a good idea, or whether we are really free to, say, change genders. I'll just mention a hot topic right now, this transgender movement. Is it really free? Are we really able to do that properly and completely? And, I'd suggest biblically and through experience that probably they are trying to seek after a positive freedom that they can't have. They're not really going to be able to experience life as it was not intended for them. And that's not because of some restriction that's arbitrary. It's just because of the nature. And I'm just giving you an example. You see, so there are a variety of issues that can make this subject very, very poignant, very sharp, very critical, and very relevant in today's world. We don't have what you would call autonomous libertarian freedom to just do whatever and be whatever we want. So that's some of the areas that one can go into when one discusses freedom. I think it's important to recognize that there are indeterministic elements at play in the human sphere of things. How God understands the world, we don't know, but he does allow a great variety of free play in the world, in nature. And it illustrates lessons, I think, that he is overseeing, but often it is hidden from our eyes.
Thank you very much, Michael. Wonderfully rich discussion. We did cover a lot in a short amount of time, I think. So I'm very thankful for that. Let's hear some takeaways before we conclude.
I take away 2 or 3 things. First, laws and rules are not enemies of freedom. We are free only when we live subject to God's law, which you called, and the Bible calls, the law of liberty. Yeah? Mm-hmm. And that it's designed to liberate us, to free us from evil. I would add to that evil causes, evil processes, evil consequences, and that we should focus on real freedom, which is the freedom from sin.
For me, it's like the same as Raphael, to be honest. But for me, what I can take away the most and keep it to my life, it's like the concept of freedom. Freedom is not always what we think as it is, or as let's say a Western conception of freedom, but actually is an aspect in our lives. It's more like a power or a responsibility, if I may say so. So that's why the general aspect that I can take away, I can keep it to my life.
Yeah, thank you. This is a topic that I'm also very passionate about, right? I'm researching, I'm writing about it. I'm having as many conversations as I can, even outside of Life with God, of course. So I'm very thankful for what we brought into the discussion today. I think my takeaway is a combination of what I generally think about it and the conversation we had today. And it comes down to identity. Because I understand human identity to be an interplay, to arise from an interplay of determinism and freedom. And without either of these two, I cannot see how identity would actually work. So this is the genius of God, if I can put it this way, where that interplay allows us to be who we are with the past, with the present, and the future. And the idea of interdependence arises from this, and with the whole purpose of interdependence being that we learn how to be in loving relationships with each other. And love is not always easy. In fact, many times I would say it's very challenging, but nevertheless, it is a worthy pursuit. And we kind of are naturally drawn to pursue that, right? So yeah, that's kind of my takeaway. The relation between identity, determinism, freedom, interdependence, love, and love. That stops with love. That's the top of the pyramid.
Everything starts and
So
stops with love.
thank you again, Michael. What are some of your concluding thoughts on the topic in today's conversation?
Yeah, I would wish that everyone that might watch this would reflect ever more deeply every day. Every part of their life should be filled with thoughts of what freedom really is and the spiritual origin of it. Often, I think in our world around us, we're so obsessed with political or social freedom that we don't look inwardly and realize that the real freedom God wants us is a freedom of the mind, not simply some type of social or political freedom. We don't want to be slaves of ambition, slaves of money, slaves of selfishness, slaves of identity, politics or anything like that, all of the worldly agendas that go on. Whether or not the worldly cause is worthwhile, the Christian still has a deeper inward freedom. We want to be free in our minds. You can be free politically, you can be rich, you can be wealthy, you can be powerful. And like some of the leaders of the present and the past, you can be a slave to yourself, and that's unfortunate. So freedom needs to come from the Holy Spirit dwelling in us.
A heartfelt thank you to our special guests and to the student panelists for their thoughtful engagement. On behalf of our sponsor, the Adventist Theological Society, and on behalf of the Life with God team, I would like to also thank our viewers and our listeners for being here. We hope that you have learned some new and helpful insights that will transform you more into the likeness of God and empower you to become a better human being. As you can see, these conversations bring together young adults and scholars who have dedicated their lives to advancing our understanding of God, of the Bible, and of the complex human personhood. It is a unique opportunity for you to get to know these committed servant leaders and learn from them as they interact with students from around the world. If you would like to support this podcast, you can do so with your presence, your comments, your prayers, and by sharing the program. If you're so inclined, you can also extend your financial support by donating to the Adventist Theological Society. To do so, go to www.atsjats.org/resources and find the Donate Now button. Make sure you also subscribe to the Adventist Theological Society YouTube channel, where you will find past and ongoing seasons. Thank you again, and I hope that you will join us next time as well.